I don't think it's difficult to keep cool in a crisis if you're in the middle of it, having to respond minute by minute to things that are going on. You're so drawn into the events that it doesn't seem anywhere near as dramatic as it does to people outside. So I think the people who found the crisis really dramatic were actually people watching it on television who switched on for 5 minutes a day and had the highlights, as it were. You know, even a boring football game can be made interesting if you only see 3 minutes highlights on Match of the Day. And I think that's true of a crisis. So that a lot of the time when we were going through events that people thought were very dramatic, there were a lot of rather tedious, drawn out meetings and events. But we were so swept up in the actual dealing with it and taking decisions that that's all you can focus on. So I don't think it's difficult to keep cool in those circumstances. The tricky thing, I think, is to try and rise above it and see the big picture. And that's the thing you have to be able to do in order to make the right decisions minute by minute that come along. And that is not easy to do because you're so overwhelmed by things happening minute by minute that you need to be able to step back and think about the bigger picture. That, I think, is the hard thing to do.
It was quite clear that you were able to do two rather critical things in a crisis, and that's number one, think, which is rather important, and number two, keep your sense of humour. Right? I mean, which I think is important for you, but also those around you. So, for example, can you tell us a story when you were on the interview with Radio 4 and you talked about the example of Alistair Darling and Jaguar?
Well, so let me make the main point first. I think some of the listeners to the radio programme were upset that I said, we had to make it fun at times because it were clearly very serious events and many people lost their jobs. And it wasn't fun in that sense, but what I was trying to get across was that I had to get my team and everyone in the bank to work day and night, and in many cases all night, not just for a week, but actually month after month and for several years. You can't motivate people to do that unless you can have a time when you can close the door and a team around me, small team around me, we would have a sense of black humour and we'd have to have a good laugh. Unless you can do that, have lighter moments, you can't force people to work at that high intensity all the time. You've got to have periods of light, shade and light. So the the example I had with Alistair Darling was that we would meet together with the Financial Services Authority on a regular basis to discuss the latest problems in the banking sector. And we would have in front of us the papers about different institutions that had got into trouble in the last few days. And for some reason, the Financial Services Authority decided that they all had to have code names. I don't think this was terribly helpful because the meetings were secret, but anyway, they all had code names. And they had unusual code names, and one of the meetings started and someone said, "We must discuss with you the serious problems at Jaguar, Chancellor." Good God. And I was taken aback by this, and this went on for 15 minutes before Alistair Darling and I realised that we were not discussing the Jaguar Motor Company, but we were discussing some bank which had been given a code name of Jaguar. At that point, we were slightly relieved because at least the problems hadn't spread to the best industrial companies in the UK.
No, that's brilliant because I think, as you said, you can take your responsibility ridiculously seriously, but you need to keep the tone sometimes light. Otherwise, people can't think under that ridiculous amount of pressure.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. Talking about thinking. I mean, that is interesting. I was listening to your Desert Island Discs on Radio 4, and one of the things that you were saying is how important it was for you during the crisis to segment time to actually think. Right. So you blocked out part of your morning just for reflection and for thinking. Which, I mean, I talked to Daniel Goleman, the author of Emotional Intelligence, and one of the things he was saying that very often leaders under a crisis they literally can panic, which shuts down their neocortex, the executive functioning part of the brain, which enables them to think, which is not something you want to be shutting down during a crisis. So it's very good that you were able to do that. Is that something that you were able to do and you've been trying to force yourself to do throughout your career?
I tried hard to do it, though. Just before I became governor, I went and talked to a lot of people who'd held down very big jobs, both in the public and private sector. And one of the things I drew from those conversations was the importance to keep time for thinking. Because if you just get swept up with being busy, then you lose track of what's happening in the organisation and you don't see the big picture. So I basically started with a ground rule. It wasn't easy to keep it going all the time, especially in the crisis, but I did by and large stick to it, that the mornings were for thinking and the afternoons were for meetings.
Brilliant.
And it has to be that way round,
Yeah.
because once you've been through, at least as far as I'm concerned, once you spent at least half a day doing nothing but meetings, the ability to think clearly after that is not, it's not that's quite as easy as it seemed. And I just wanted to go in there and, read information that had come in, and then just think to myself. So I'd, write speeches, make notes on what I thought were the big points, but generally try to keep the time just to think, because you really ought to spend as much time thinking about what you've read as you spend reading. And if you just read for 3 hours and think, oh, I'm brief now, but then spend 5 minutes reflecting on what you've read, you won't actually absorb it, and you just need to think through, what do I think about what I've read? And it is a key part to being a leader in any organisation.